At the stroke of the midnight hour,
August the 15th is the birthday of the independent
India will
and
awake to
sovereign
life
state
and
of
freedom.
Pakistan.
A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new.
It marks the fulfillment of the destiny of the Muslim nation, which has made great sacrifices in the past few years to have its homeland.
It is fitting that at this solemn moment we take the pledge of dedication to the service of India and her.
It gives them an opportunity to demonstrate to the world how a nation containing many elements can live in peace and amity.
We end today a period of ill fortune, and India discovers herself again.
Today we take the two-nation theory as fact. India and Pakistan is two separate, incompatible entities that cannot coexist. A belief hardened by the horrors of partition and the continued communal violence witnessed in both nations since 1947. Yet it is my contention that at the end of the day this fracture is only 78 years old. And what is that to a millennia of cross-migration, trade, and cultural transaction? The acclaimed Pakistani historian Aisha Jalal has called partition the central historical event in 20th century South Asia. She writes, "A defining moment that is neither beginning nor end. Partition continues to influence how the peoples and states of post-colonial South Asia envisage their past, present, and future." But was there ever an alternative? Was fragmentation the only practical solution for the region after the departure of the British? Was partition indeed inevitable? The first Islamic conquest of India happened in 1021 with the fall of Lahore. By 1192, Persianized Turks had seized Delhi from its Hindu rulers. By 1323, they had established a sultanate that stretched to the tip of the peninsula, and from Gujarat to Bengal. Today, these rulers are primarily categorized as Muslim invaders. But medieval Sanskrit inscriptions identified them by their linguistic and ethnic affiliation, which means they weren't perceived first and foremost by their religious identities. William Dalrymple, a prominent writer on the subject, contests that within a few centuries, a hybrid Indo-Islamic civilization emerged along with hybrid languages, notably Urdu. More on that later. For the most part, there was religious harmony, or at the very least a degree of mutual respect between one and the other. Sufi mystics were inspired by Hindu scriptures and practices. In medieval Hindu texts from South India, the Sultan of Delhi is sometimes talked about as the incarnation of Vishnu. Dara Shikoh, the Mughal prince in the 17th century, had the Gita translated to Persian and composed a study of Hinduism and Islam, the mingling of two oceans. However, we would be remiss not to mention that many Mughal emperors sowed the seeds for discord with their relentless conquests at establishing Islamic dominance, most notably Aurangzeb. When the British came to our doorstep, however, this coexistence began to rupture even more rapidly. Alex von Tunzelmann observes that when the British started to define communities based on religious identity and attach political representation to them, many Indians stopped accepting the diversity of their own thoughts and began to ask themselves in which of the boxes they belonged. Yasmin Khan says that partition stands testament to the follies of empire, which ruptures community evolution, distorts historical trajectories, and forces violent state formation from societies that would otherwise have taken different and unknowable paths. During and after the Second World War, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah became the strongest voice pushing for partition. In 1946, in an address to the United States, he claimed that partition was the only practical solution, which will see pure freedom of both Hindus and Muslims. Weary of being subjugated to Hindu domination, he said, "Hundreds of millions of Muslims will never agree merely to a change of masters. What's interesting, however, is that Jinnah did not always feel this way, and investigating what happened in the preceding years to bring him to this conclusion, this two-nation theory, reveals that perhaps partition was even less inevitable in the process of decolonization than most would like to consider. Jinnah was hardly the ideal face for an Islamist nation. This lawyer with an Anglican education, fond of Savile Row suits, Scotch whiskey, and allegedly ham sandwiches, was once seen as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. He reproached Gandhi for his bringing in of spiritual sensibilities into the political discussion, saying it was a crime to mix up politics and religion, and it only emboldened religious chauvinists on all sides. He spent his early career as a member of both the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress, and strived to bring them together, for which he was given the title of Ambassador of Unity. The political conflict between the Muslim League and the Congress is a complex one to summarize in a video essay, but to put it simply, what Nehru wanted was a federal government with power concentrated in the center, whereas Jinnah pushed for a more decentralized power structure that allowed the Muslim provinces autonomy to govern in line with their ideologies and interests. What to Jinnah and the League was a safeguarding of Muslim interests, to Nehru and the Congress was a fragmentation of Indian unity. In 1942, the Quit India movement saw leaders of the Congress party arrested, leaving a political vacuum for Jinnah to consolidate power. In 1946, with Labour Prime Minister Attlee now in charge, the process for British departure was accelerated. Lord Mountbatten was appointed. Nehru continued to shut down the demands of the League. He was of the mind that a maimed India was better than a loose India. This was compounded by his vicious hatred of Jinnah. He wrote in his diary, "Jinnah offers an obvious example of an utter lack of the civilized mind. With all his cleverness and ability, he produces an impression on me of utter ignorance and lack of understanding. Instinctively, I think it is better to have Pakistan or almost anything, if only to keep Jinnah far away, and not allow his muddled and arrogant head from interfering continually in India's progress." At this point, Jinnah began to push more and more heavily for partition. However, privately he confessed that it was always a bargaining chip to bring the Congress to the negotiating table. Far from the only practical solution, it was a tactical solution. But from that point on, violence on the streets between Hindus and Muslims began to escalate. People moved away from or were forced out of mixed neighborhoods and took refuge in increasingly polarized ghettos. Tensions were often heightened by local and regional political leaders. H. Suravarti, the ruthless Muslim League chief minister of Bengal, made incendiary speeches in Calcutta, provoking rioters against his own Hindu populace, and writing in a newspaper that bloodshed and disorder are not necessarily evil in themselves if resorted to for a noble cause. As this violence intensified and animosity between Nehru and Jinnah grew, even those who opposed this divide staunchly began to see it as inevitable. Blinded by his intimacy with Nehru, the details of which I've added to the description as it is simply too distracting, and by his own personal ego, Lord Mountbatten arbitrarily chose August 15, 1947 as the date of the British departure, a full year prior to the previously agreed deadline, later confessing he pulled it out of the blue as he was determined to show he was master of the whole event. On the eve of partition, he said the best way to teach a youngster to cycle was to take him to the top of a hill, put him on the seat and push him down the hill. By the time he reached the bottom, he'd have learnt to cycle. What was the end result? Unprecedented sectarian violence. A photojournalist who had been there for the liberation of a concentration camp in Nazi Germany declared she saw no difference between that and the gates of Calcutta. Within a few months, the landscape of South Asia had changed irrevocably. In 1941, Karachi, designated the first capital of Pakistan, was 47% Hindu. Delhi, the capital of independent India, was 1/3 Muslim. By the end of the decade, almost all the Hindus of Karachi had fled, while 200,000 Muslims had been forced out of Delhi. The changes made in a matter of months remain indelible 70 years later. Jinnah accused the dreamers of an undivided India of homogenizing Hindus and Muslims as one, and challenged their peaceful coexistence. But in the same breath homogenized the Muslims of Lahore with the Muslims of Dhaka, the Muslims of Karachi with the Muslims of Balochistan. The subcontinent is far too wide and diverse for such an effort, and would ultimately result in a terrible genocide and the establishment of Bangladesh in 1971, and the continued separatist movement of the Baloch. Historians Aisha Jalal and Sujata Bose state that the colossal human tragedy of the partition and its continuing aftermath has been better conveyed by sensitive creative writers and artists than by historians. Under the project of nation building, the horrors of partition were cast aside. Victims of violence remained without justice, and their souls remained without utterance. Of these forms, it was literature that was able to deal most directly with this rupture. Poets of undivided India, such as Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Sadat Hasan Manto, and Josh Malihabadi, began asking themselves, are we now Indian poets or Pakistani poets? Were we always one or the other? They wrote poetry and short stories that dug into this crisis of identity, as well as the individual experiences of partition. Faiz Ahmed Faiz, previously an Indian poet, now a Pakistani one, wrote Subh Azadi, which I quoted in the introduction. This poem dug into the cost of partition and reads as a sort of response to Nehru's speech Tryst with Destiny, recited in Delhi at midnight on 14th August 1947. Nehru spoke of a dawn wherein India awakes to life and freedom and finds itself again. In the wake of this, Faiz asks, is this the dawn we waited for? Josh Malihabadi became one of the Muhajirs, which was the name given to Muslims who migrated into Pakistan after partition. Malihabadi did not leave immediately, but after many years, when he began to fear the decline of Urdu in India, as well as the relentless persecution of Muslims. He wrote Matham-e-Azadi. "O friend, don't ask me for the tale of Hindustan. Our throats were torn by the scratching of our songs. When we escaped the sword, we were beheaded by the veins of the rose." Similarly, Sadat Hasan Manto, another Muhajir, made the journey in 1948 by ship, fearing that the environment in Bombay where he resided had grown far too hostile for Muslims to inhabit. He continued to write harrowing stories of partition violence that dug into the cost of this only practical solution. He wrote chilling stories of sectarian sexual violence in stories such as Thanda Ghosh and Kholdo, and biting satire in stories such as The Dog of Tetwal, the story of a stray dog that became the shared pet of the Indian and Pakistani armies that gets caught up between the two when tensions rise. Manto writes, "The dog jumped and flapped its ears violently. From his position, Subedar Himmat Khan fired his second shot, which buried itself near the front paws of the dog. Frightened out of its wits, it ran about sometimes in one direction, sometimes the other. Jamadar Harnam Singh, in a state of great fury, uttered a terrible oath, took careful aim and fired. The bullet struck the dog in the leg, and its cry pierced the sky. The dog changed its direction and, limping, began running towards Subedar Himmat Khan's camp." Manto saw the creation of Pakistan as both a personal and a communal disaster. The tragedy of partition, he wrote, was not that there were now two countries instead of one, but the realization that human beings in both countries were slaves. Slaves of bigotry, slaves of religious passions, slaves of animal instincts and barbarity.
No doubt that the state language of Pakistan is going to be Urdu and no other language. And anyone who tries to mislead you is really the enemy of Pakistan.
And thus, Urdu became forever synonymous with Pakistani sympathies, which had no place in the nation-building project in India. S.R. Farooqi said, "In independent India, severe punishment was meted out to Urdu because it was equated with a language that divided up the country. Today, the language's relationship is increasingly tempestuous, and it itself is in rapid decline. So I want to take a minute here to recount its history. Urdu emerged over centuries through linguistic and cultural exchanges in North India. Its foundation lay in Khari Boli, the local dialect spoken in and around Delhi, which provided the grammatical and syntactical framework. Sufi poet Amir Khusro is often regarded as one of the first figures to acknowledge and contribute to the development of Urdu as a language. Writing in the 13th century, he referred to the language of the common people as Hindvi, a term used at the time for the local vernacular. Khusro composed verses that mixed Persian and indigenous vocabulary, reflecting the multilingual environment of medieval India. It was not until the late 18th century that this language came to be referred to as Urdu in literary circles. However, historians assert that through the 18th century, the distinction between Hindi and Urdu was not yet rigid, and the language was still evolving within the court and literary traditions. By the early 19th century, the two began to emerge as separate literary traditions. The variant that retained Persian, Arabic, and Turkic vocabulary came to be known as Urdu, while the version that sought to replace these with Sanskrit-derived words became Hindi. However, this distinction was merely a literary and ideological one, as both remained mutually intelligible at the spoken level. Before the 19th century, Urdu was indexical not of Muslims, but rather of class and education. Indexicality refers to the link people establish between language and its cultural meanings, including issues of class, ethnicity, and power. The association of Urdu with Muslim identity was not an organic development, but a colonial construct. Colonial scholars and Christian missionaries, faced with a lack of standardized teaching resources, categorized languages along communal lines. By classifying Urdu as a Muslim language and distinguishing it from Hindi, which was associated with Hindus, they contributed to the communalization of linguistic identities in India. This, coupled with the emergence of the Hindu nationalist movement, led to a belief that Urdu was an alien product. Though it had its roots in the Gangetic Plain, it needed to be exiled from the land. Shiva Prasad in 1868 demanded that Urdu not be the language of the courts. He asserted, "I cannot see the wisdom of the policy which thrusts a Semitic element into the bosoms of Hindus and alienates them from their Aryan speech. To read Persian is to become Persianized. All ideas become corrupt and our nationality is lost." Woolard and Schieffelin remind us that ideologies about language are statements about people who speak it. In March 2017, two Muslim members of the UP Legislative Assembly, Alam Badi and Nafis Ahmed, took their oath of office in Urdu, which the Speaker of Assembly invalidated and forced them to retake in Hindi, on the grounds that Urdu was not a recognized language for the conduct of official business in the Assembly, which is untrue as Urdu is one of the official languages of Uttar Pradesh. In the same year, Musharraf Hussain, a newly elected corporator in the Aligarh Municipal Corporation, was charged for trying to hurt the religious feelings of Hindus because he took his oath of office in Urdu. These are two of a myriad of incidents regarding the enforcement of the erasure of Urdu from the state. When we engage in such a purge, we risk losing a part of our history and tradition. The French font designer Ladislas Mandel once wrote that a letter is not just a sound, it is the trace of mankind. Shahzaman Haq, writing about the erasure of Urdu, explains, "The more that people perpetuate myths that erase elements of Indian history, the more they cultivate the attitude that certain scripts, languages, cultures, and peoples do not belong in India." Historian Audrey Trutchke calls this purge a cruel denial of heritage. At the end of the day, just to speak from the heart, I don't care. Speak Urdu if you like, don't speak it if you don't want to. Language is not merely a question of vocabulary, but a question of grammar, and Urdu and Hindi share the same syntax. Most Hindi speakers and most Urdu speakers never really exclusively speak one or the other. Why I've dwelled so long on the question of Urdu is that it exposes the folly of the two-nation theory. Language belongs to a region, not to a religion. That is why Bangladesh rejected the imposition of Urdu and fought for Bangla as a national language. Urdu was imposed in Pakistan the same way Hindi is imposed here. In Pakistan, did the Sindhis speak Urdu? No. Did the Pathans? No. Did the Balochis? No. Who spoke it primarily were the Muhajirs who came from India. It was imposed on the populace, ironically enough, by a man who could not speak Urdu to save his life. Jinnah proclaimed on the eve of its conception that Pakistan would be a secular state, welcoming of all religions, castes, and creeds. However, it was a state founded on the belief that Muslims cannot coexist with Hindus. It is a state founded on religious identity, making it a core tenet of its policies. It gives validity to the argument that such a state can and should exist, further fueling the argument for a comparable Hindu state in what is now India. That is why we must again and again return to this question of inevitability. Today, 78 years since partition, it is the origin point for all conflict. But as Jason Cons puts it, the geographical coverage of South Asia has always been fluctuating, and what we think of as fixed national units were only one of many possibilities imagined in the years following independence. Nishat Sanzagri writes that maps in South Asia don't just depict space, they discipline it. She further writes that over the course of a century, a world of circular migration and overlapping diasporas was reduced to a sea of nations. South Asia in particular came to embody a paradox. Most of its nation-states define themselves not by what they are, but by what they are not. As Ashish Nandi observed, Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Nepal try desperately not to be India, while Bangladesh avoids being both India and Pakistan. Lastly, she concludes, when we reduce conflict to a contest between fixed, eternal adversaries, we forget the long entanglements that came before. We forget that for centuries, identity in this region was shaped not by flags, but by movement, by trade, faith, marriage, memory. We forget that borders are not timeless truths, but tools, and like all tools, they can be repurposed, or at the very least, reimagined. Nida Fazli writes, "Utha hai dilo jaan se dhua dono taraf hi. Ye mir ka diwa yahan bhi hai, wahan bhi." Smoke rises from the hearts and souls on both sides. Mir's poetry lingers here as well as there. I do not advocate for a colorblind approach here. It is a mistake to say we're all one and the same at the end of the day because we simply aren't. We're an incredibly diverse region, but we needn't be so divided. We've informed each other's traditions and cultures for millennia, so why stop now? To create this idealized, homogenized heartland of India, all traces of the past, anything remotely Pakistani or Mughal, must be eradicated. India is defined by virtue of it not being Pakistani or Muslim, so all must go. But what do we gain from this process? Are we to be so blind to understand that this rich, diverse subcontinent is shaped by a history of conquests and migrations? Decolonization should mean an upliftment from the economic and social structures that bound us, not a rewriting of history and a fragmentation of its peoples. Because with this peninsula, you risk erasing its identity itself.